We're very happy to still have Rebecca Tinsley with us, and we now have Gregory Stanton from Genocide Watch. So we'd like to welcome you to this discussion and just continue our interview with a question regarding Syria and the situation at the moment, what you think can be done given the devastation that has already happened, and also this idea of referring to what's going on in Syria, which has been the case of the Syrian government, as a civil war. How do we deal with this idea when what really is happening is mass atrocity?
Well, there was a period when people kept saying, and we had been warning, by the way, 2 years before this all happened, that Syria was about to blow up. But there was a period in which the demonstrations began during the Arab Spring, and snipers were put on the roof, and they were literally shooting people in the head. So unlike other countries in the Arab Spring, they were, the demonstrators were literally being shot down. The announcers started to say, this could turn into a civil war, as though it weren't already. And of course, gradually, you had more and more people dying until you had about 4,700 people dead. And then they started calling it a civil war. Well, a lot of people who talk about civil war think that if it's a civil war, it can't also be genocide, when in fact genocide very often occurs during civil wars or during international wars. In fact, most genocides do. So what has happened now in Syria is that it is a civil war, no question. But there have also been genocidal massacres occurring during it. For instance, the Hula massacre. There have been a number of others. One in which the Shahiba, the Alawite militias, massacred about 600 Sunni Muslims in one village. Those are acts of genocide because they single out people because of their religious group. So it's important to remember about the Genocide Convention. It does not require that you try to wipe out an entire group. It is the intentional destruction in whole or in part of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. I like the term genocidal massacres. My teacher, Leo Cooper, said that was a very useful concept, so that people didn't always go around looking to see if, one group was trying to wipe out the entire other group. Because then you get into really useless debates about whether something is genocide or not. That's what happened during Darfur. I mean, the UN sat and argued about whether it was genocide for 3 months while people were just being slaughtered. And this was really it was crazy, because crimes against humanity are just as bad as genocide. People were literally dying by the tens of thousands while this debate was going on. And of course, in Rwanda, we know the famous Shelley interview in which somebody said, well, we can only call them acts of genocide. And a reporter asked, well, how many acts of genocide do we have to have before we call it a genocide?
Right, exactly.
At one point on Syria, I can't help but think that we were so slow in reacting to what was happening in Syria that there was a polarization of the anti-Assad people. They started out being moderate, bravely marching on the streets, and because they got no help from the outside world, no recognition, the politics of it polarized, and the Mujahideen people arrived, and the Muslim Brotherhood kidnapped, if you like, what should have been a broad-based non-violent protest. And we've seen that again and again in these situations, because we hold back, because we're so confused, or we're morally equivalent because we're ignorant. We think, they're all the same as each other, ancient ethnic hatreds or whatever. It's our racism, of course, and that's not helped by your point about the media simplifying things or simply confusing things, as they did in Rwanda. And if only there had been a little bit more clarity on our point from the outside world against Assad, we might not have seen this awful polarization that has now perverted the course of what was a popular revolution.
Sure.
That's correct. And also, of course, paralyzed the UN Security Council, because Assad has, his friends with the Russians and Chinese. It's meant that the UN Security Council once again has been completely unable to deal with the situation.
And when we see time and time again this kind of blockade from the Security Council as a result of the veto power, and quite often used with Russia and China in this case, and many other cases, what are alternative measures that can be done? How can we go around the system in terms of really dealing with genocide?
Well, just the way the Arab League did. They went straight to the General Assembly. There is a resolution that was passed during the Korean War, before the Korean War actually, called the Uniting for Peace Resolution, that is still in effect, in which, and the U.S. doesn't like it anymore because we don't have a veto. But in the General Assembly can actually authorize action by the United Nations whenever the UN Security Council is so paralyzed that it cannot. That's how the Korean so-called police action was authorized, and it is in fact what the Arab League did. They went to the General Assembly, and by an overwhelming majority, I think they got 170 votes or something like this, had a condemnation of what the Assad regime was doing in Syria.
Thank you very much. My final question would be to you regarding your work. We're all aware of your 8 stages of genocide. How's it going with the book? And do you have any inside information on your 10 stages of genocide?
Well, having worked on this for a number of years now, the 8 stages became sort of iconic. It's really, I must say, amusing to me, because I wrote them in 1996 when I was in the State Department, and I realized that one of the reasons the State Department did what it did, waited so long and so forth, is that most of the diplomats didn't even know what genocide is and didn't know what the early warning signs are. So I wrote this model, this 8-stage model. In a nutshell, it is classification, symbolization, dehumanization, organization, polarization, preparation, extermination, and finally denial. Well, some of my academic colleagues, because I'm, a teacher too, said, you really need a couple more stages in there. Between symbolization and dehumanization, there is really another stage, and that is discrimination.
Sure.
And they're right. And they also pointed out that there were 2 kinds of preparation. One was the kind of preparation that the perpetrator group does when it organizes its armies and builds its death camps and so forth. And then the other kind is the persecution of the group that is going to be the victim group. So if you will, the other new stage in the 10 stages is going to be persecution. So the idea behind the book is a 150-page book that is useful for teachers in every secondary school in the United States, the UK, Canada, anywhere. And we intend to immediately translate it into German and French and Spanish and a whole lot of other languages. And we also intend to e-publish it in such a way that it will be available to teachers all over the world for practically nothing, so they can use it.
Fantastic. We're all very much looking forward to reading the book and hoping that it does, in fact, reach all of these second education institutes and Thank you very much. I now open the floor to questions from the audience. If that's yeah.
One question. As part of the civil society, I wonder how, when we are confronted with such astonishing situation as nowadays Syria, what we can effectively do. Because sometimes we have this feeling that we don't know really what to do, what we can do. And I think this is a problem because we have lots of energy and we have lots of willingness to engage ourselves, but we don't know where to engage. And I think there are lots of people, as me, that has this feeling.
I think that's a really valid and hard question. Let me address it in two ways. First of all, let's address the problem of psychic numbing, which we've already talked about a little bit. Paul Slovic, who is a social psychologist out at the University of Oregon, has actually done experiments with this, in which he's showed a picture of a little girl in Mali and said, look, here's $5. She's going to starve to death if you don't give her any money. Will you give her some money? And over 50% of the people will give the $5. And then he shows them a picture of two children, little Musa and little, this other little girl, and the percentage who will give the money actually goes down. He then says this little girl represents 21 million people in Africa, children in Africa who are going to starve if you don't give it. If you don't give the money to one of these relief organizations that's going to help them. And, these are very reputable relief organizations like Catholic Relief or CARE or, one of these other groups. It falls to 10% of the people who will give that money. So one of the first things, of course, is keep them alive. I mean, humanitarian assistance is crucial during genocides. You're bound to have refugees. And so giving money to groups that actually are going to help keep these people alive. The other thing, of course, is to help fund and help get money to groups that are going to put pressure in the right places, in the right political places. And those will be groups, like ours, like International Crisis Group, like her group, other groups that know where to push down on the lever of power, where people can actually take action. Because we know who the people are in the National Security Council and who the people are in the Defense Department and in the State Department to actually take action. So when we find out that there's something that needs to be done, and sometimes it will come from one of you, we can take that action. I, for example, one night got a call in the middle of the night from Saskatchewan saying, they just murdered 434 people, Anuak people, in my hometown, in Gambela, Ethiopia. And I said, how'd you find this out? Well, I got a call from someone there. And he had, left Ethiopia and settled. And I said, can you give me some numbers so I can corroborate this? So I got some numbers. I got the number of the governor of Gambela province, for instance, and called him up. He had to leave the province later because he was Anuak himself. They had literally identified the leadership of the Anuak community in that town, had gone around and marked their houses and massacred all of the main leaders in that town. I also checked with some UN people and others to make sure this had really happened and so forth. And then I called the desk officer in the State Department that I knew because I had worked in the State Department. This was in the middle of the night, believe me. I mean, he had to be very tolerant to put up with a call from me. But he was not only tolerant, he called up the ambassador, who was a terrific ambassador, one of these people who really takes action. Her name is Oriella Braziel, and she walked into Prime Minister Meles Zenawi's office and said, you have to stop this now. And I am sending a political officer with Marine Guards down to Gambella today to check out what is happening down there. And they did. And the result was that those massacres stopped. So, that is a good example of where you, if you have information, can find it.
Can I answer a wonderful and inspiring story, but I was going to answer your question in terms of non-financial action that you can do. And of course the problem is, for those of us who marched against the Iraq War in our millions, we soon came to realize that the day of the demonstration having much impact is probably over. But there's new media. And I go back to when I worked for the BBC. If we had 6 letters complaining about any program, we considered it a tidal wave of opinion. Because so few people, millions get angry, but who actually gets to the point of putting the stamp on the letter or now pushing the email? So your voice must be heard. You can always make your voice heard, writing to your elected representatives, writing to companies who are doing bad things by propping up genocidal dictators and telling them that you're going to boycott their products. Whether it's a bank that is, like Barclays Bank that support the Zimbabwean regime to this day, to their shame, or boycotting products. You have power. They don't want you to know that you have power, but you do.
That's very, very good answer. When Alison DeForge went in to talk with Anthony Lake about the Rwandan genocide, he said, "We haven't heard anything from you." And she said, "What do you mean? I've been trying to talk to you and called you and everything for quite the last few weeks." And he said, "Oh, I didn't mean you personally. I meant we haven't heard from anybody about this. No letters to me. I'm the National Security Advisor. Why?" In other words, he hadn't felt the pressure. So that is exactly right what she just said.
Thank you to both Gregory Stanton and Rebecca Tinsley for those wonderful thoughts and comments. Unfortunately, we do have to end the interview now. Could keep going on, but I think we have a lot to be to think about and to contemplate and hopefully to act on. So thank you to everybody for listening, and thank you to our honourable guest.
Oh, listen, she's one of my heroes, so I want it for me.
Well, there you go.
This is a real treat.
There you go. Thank you very much.
And thank you. Thank you for the.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate you.
We will keep in touch.